Nina Power, welcome to the University of Sheffield and to the Prokhof Centre.
Thank you.
I want to take this interview in two parts, and first of all talk about this book, One Dimensional Woman, and then in the second part of our interview look at a collection of your essays which was published in German, and the German is das kollektive politische Subjekt, the collective political subject. But let's talk about One Dimensional Woman first. Talk to me about the title first, because the title is an allusion to another book, is it not?
Yes, it's a reference to Marcuse's One Dimensional Man. Well, really it's a reference to the English translation of Marcuse's book, because the German Mensch really means mankind, which includes men and women. So it's a joke, it's a kind of play on the fact that man refers both to like men and women, but also to man specifically. So my title is an obvious kind of jokey reference to that title.
Could one describe the book as a feminist update of Marcuse's classic study?
Yeah, I think, but it's not just a play on words, right? So it's also owes something to Marcuse's analysis, which is to say, to try to think about what politics means in an age of consumerism. And so I was trying to think about what feminism means in a sort of capitalist consumerist world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's take this difficult word, one-dimensional, which seems a strange word to use when referring to people. So why is it one-dimensional woman?
Well, I mean, to think about one's life as a sort of in the round, as it were, to think about all of the possible expressions of one's character, one's being, one's capacities. You know, I mean, it's a kind of classic Marxist point in a certain way that all of our capacities under a certain kind of capitalism, under certain forms of labour, the need to work, which most people have, they must exchange their labour power in exchange for a wage. So that all of our human capacities, so our capacities to do lots of different things, are kind of funneled into very specific channels when we, have to spend our time doing something we might not want to do. So the one-dimensional is kind of critical, of course. It's also, again, a sort of joke, right? So who wants to be a one-dimensional character? It's like saying someone's a cardboard cutout. But what I'm really referring to is the kind of images of women in particular that were being presented at this time, that I was sort of seeing and everyone else was looking at, and the book is quite old now. It was written primarily before the global economic crisis. And in a way, it sort of talks about an age sort of at the end of a kind of, in Britain at least, a new labour project, when there's a certain...
It came out in 2009,
yeah.
Yes.
But in a way, it's kind of it's almost like a slightly posthumous book about an age that was just coming to an end.
Reflective of an older period,
yeah. Yeah.
So the one-dimensionality in Marcuse, and I think also in your book, consists in the fact that all peoples, man as the German Mensch, desires and aspirations and needs and ambitions become reduced to something quite simple, and that what all these things become reduced to is a sort of context of consumerism and commercialism and basically capitalism, so that our desires and our needs, our true needs, are molded by the capitalist system. That's the basic, or one of the basic things that Marcuse says.
Yeah.
That's the statement in your book as well, I think, specifically looking at women. Could you give some examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of say a bit more on that point. I mean, yeah, it's really a question of freedom. If we're living in a world where we're presented with supposed free choice, but if all these choices turn out to be rubbish, it's not great freedom, right? So I'm interested in what it might mean to be freely expressive, to express all of these different aspects. So in relation to women, what I was responding to, and I was, in my mid-20s, really, when I was writing these sorts of things, and these were also experiences that I underwent, and as many people did, as someone who was sort of trying to study, trying to sort of work out what I was doing with my life, doing part-time agency work, which was sort of branded and sold to us as a form of liberation, like this idea of like flexible labour, but you kind of don't have any rights, really. So it's this idea of like how your sort of lack of freedom is branded, as a sort of choice, right? So you're kind of, you're like, as a part-time agency worker, sort of on call, you have to go anywhere. It's kind of even worse now. I mean, this was even before kind of 0-hour contracts were brought in the UK. But, I felt, extremely cynical and critical about this sort of idea that this was in any way a form of liberation, right? So, and the same would go for consumerism as well, like the idea that you can somehow buy feminism. So at that time, and now still as well, the idea that kind of feminism has anything to do with consumer choice, that one expresses one's feminism in the things that one purchases, is an incredibly narrow image, right, about what feminism might mean. So I was also responding to both aspects, both the sort of selling of labour and the sort of consumerist dimensions of a certain kind of capitalist fantasy, really, that was being sold. And it was branded in a very feminized way. And this is also about a broader transition in labour as well, because obviously in Britain we had the kind of shutdown of industry, which was typically male. We're in Sheffield. You mentioned the Full Monty earlier, and that film is also really about the decline of a certain kind of industry and the feminization also of men. And I talk about that in the book because when you have a deliberate political decision made that the country is going to shift from particular kinds of labour, industrial labour, towards a more kind of communicative, knowledge-based, service-based economy, and then that itself was being branded as something that was particularly relevant to women, or that these industries were being feminized, both at the level of the kind of inclusion of women, like more women were being encouraged to work in these industries, but also the industries themselves were being branded.
And based on presumed typically feminine
based
qualities,
on certain kind of stereotypes
ability
around.
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you look at first of all the labour market, then you have this idea of the sort of the flexibilization of work, where people are being told, well, you can change jobs anytime and so on, but at the same time they have to be able to change jobs anytime because they can be got rid of basically any time, so that people are then almost kind of have to be in life in such a way that they, or act in a life in such a way that they're kind of walking CVs, as you describe it. So they become kind of advertisements for themselves, which then also means that the distinction between public and private, between work and non-work, or recreation and so the private sphere, then disappears. I think what Habermas has talked about this in the terms of the Kolonialisierung der Lebenswelt, the colonization of the life world. Could you talk a little bit about these changes that you just described in terms of that disappearance of the distinction between the private and the public, between work and non-work?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, I'm not the only person to kind of comment on this, although I try to look at it in a kind of, sort of slightly more anecdotal and feminist way, really, about what it means to be a walking CV. I mean, I like this formulation I came up with because, the idea that one is constantly, being pressured in a way to do things in order to appeal to an employer, and there is a sense in which a lot of education was sort of gearing itself in that direction, that everything had to be somehow as if for a job, that this was the most important thing in life, was making sure an employer wanted you. And so there's that question of desire. It's like, is my desire really the desire of the employer, right? It's not the desire of like my friends or, my desire to enjoy a hobby, or, that everything becomes about labour in a certain way. And so I make a joke about, where before young women may be encouraged to, present themselves as kind of possibly good wives. Now they're being encouraged to present themselves as possibly good employees. This is the desire question. And so I think that kind of, so the walking CV, if that separation ever really existed, I mean, that's a very difficult question as well, between the private and the public, and that obviously shifts over time, and we can talk about where the private and the public might reside. And of course, there are also feminist critiques of the private sphere as well, because the private sphere historically is also where, bad things happen to women, and it's kind of hidden, right, in the domestic sphere. So, that's a very complicated question. But I would say something like the sort of total domination of a certain kind of labour logic into everyday life, that one is thinking all the time about, work somehow. This seemed to be, at this time at least, what was going on. So a certain kind of psychic colonisation, a certain kind of lack of distinction between what time belongs to you and what time belongs to your employer. whoever this spectral figure is. Yeah.
Could you talk to me a little bit about that in terms of the TV series Sex and the City, which you address in the book as well, I think. Is that a reflection of that development as well?
Yeah, I haven't watched this TV show for a long time, but I suppose what was being presented there, very, very popularly, in a very popular series, was a certain image of they're all different women in a way, but the general context is one of a city in which they are kind of workers and consumers, and and that their sort of sex lives are also sort of up for a kind of public presentation in a certain way. I mean, at least that's how it's kind of sold, that there's a certain kind of fantasy image of an enjoyment that one can have, if you like, that it does kind of involve a relation between work, consumerism and sex, and this was being branded, I would say, as something desirable, as something, this is something to aspire to, this kind of metropolitan thing. And you could say, well, what's wrong with that? Maybe that is a way of enjoying oneself in a city.
But you're saying that it's actually problematic in many ways.
Well,
so these women feel that they are free, and they've got all these choices they can make, whether it is this particular handbag or that particular handbag, or this particular boyfriend and that particular boyfriend. I think you throw in a sort of the vibrator as an option as well. But you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that actually what seems to be free choices is actually molded by an overarching capitalist system. Is that right, or is that simplifying things too much?
No, I mean, but I think, that is the sort of the case, as it were, and so the question of what real freedom might be or real choice might be is sort of occluded, and I think it's kind of a rather limited choice. It's presented as, right, well, this is all there is, and this is the best you can expect. But actually, of course, like as a philosopher or as a human being, that's also a very historically specific and actually very narrow idea of what these things are, what pleasure is, what desire is, what enjoyment is, what freedom is, and so I mean, in a sense, I wanted to just break out that question and say, and I mean, we have to ask, who benefits from this? If people watch these sorts of things and feel, a sort of imperative, okay, I must be like this to some extent. Of course, people are critical. They don't go along with everything they watch and read and see. But, when you have a very paradigmatic sort of image being presented of what it means to be a young woman, let's say, then it's like, well, what, who benefits from this? Well, obviously, if you're saying consumerism is freedom, then people selling you things benefit. You say, well, that's obvious. Of course it is, right? But then it's sort of saying, well, what other forms of pleasure and enjoyment are there, in fact, outside of that? And there are many, that don't involve, consumerism. And the idea that these acts of consumerism are in themselves feminist, which was an idea that was being kind of presented by a sort of liberal mainstream kind of capitalist feminism, which is what I'm criticizing in the book. When there's so much more to feminism, especially.
Let's look at let's look at pornography for a moment, or rather the issue of pornography. The reason I'm asking about that is that there are 2 chapters in there, I think, about pornography, and it seems to me what you're trying to do is that you're trying to move beyond this dichotomy that on the one, where people on the one hand say, pornography is really bad because it objectifies and sexualizes women. And then the opposite of that, where some people say, no, on the contrary, pornography is incredibly liberating and so on. And you're trying to transcend that dichotomy, is that right?
Well, to some extent, I'm trying to say that pornography is a kind of work, and that the kind of pornography, the kind of sexual activity it presents is presented as labour, right? So it's sort of to get away in the first place from a sort of simplistic moralising of the question of what pornography is. But it also economizes it. It's like saying, well, how much money does it make? How does it actually work as an industry? And it doesn't go into too much detail, but it does present it as a material feature, right, of life that in a sense has only increased, right? I mean, the sheer amount of free pornography online, it wasn't even as extreme by any means at this time, although it was sort of, there. I mean, so... Yeah, I mean, so to try to think about pornography as both an industry, an economic fact and a phenomenon, but also as a kind of the images of sex that it presents. So one of the things that I was looking at was whether pleasure or enjoyment, how is that conveyed in pornography? So I look at the money shot, you know, and then talk about obviously the multiple meanings of that phrase, money shot, you know, like what does it mean under capitalism to talk about the money shot? You know, like which money, whose money, right? So there is sort of this kind of almost quasi-jokey look at that idea of porn in relation to consumerism, capitalism and financialization. But yeah, so it cuts off the moral question in a certain way. But, you know, I would also say that, look, there is a way in which what isn't shown often in pornography, perhaps like a kind of comedic or like Beckettian porn, what would a pornography that kind of celebrates failure and that was very funny and almost like slapstick. And of course, you could have a genre, right? The taxonomical logic of pornography is that, in a way, whatever you want to see, you can see. So I make this joke, you know, if you want to see like naked women jumping up and down on a trampoline shaving biscuits, right? There's probably some porn that exists, you know.
Yeah.
Lots of people have made this point, you know, like whatever your particular desire is, there's a niche for it. But I was kind of interested in a sort of non-taxonomical desire. What would it mean to actually have representation, so something that like works at the level of like an erotic response, that wasn't like a kind of taxonomical specificity, but rather a more sort of general sort of, I don't know, almost comedic celebration of desire as such, and all of its like strangeness and vicissitudes.
Yeah. So the book, as you say, was published in 2009 and is reflective probably of an era even before that.
Yeah.
We're now in 2019, so it's 10 years on. If someone asked you to do an update of this book, I was wondering what you would change.
In a way, not a lot of it. I mean, I would say about 2/3 of it are still relevant in terms of the direction of culture.
Which 1/3 isn't?
I think that maybe it's just at the level of tone. I wouldn't write the book in the same way. I mean, it's a polemic. It's written, you know, it was supposed to be an intervention that wasn't supposed to like hang around. You know, it's like written rhetorically as a sort of like.
It's a civilized book, though. I mean, it's not. You're not insulting people.
I think I am actually insulting people in this book.
Okay.
I wouldn't do it the same way now, but it is what it is, you know. Okay,
maybe this is because this is South Yorkshire, and some of the things are probably considered sort of pretty mild here in South Yorkshire. I was just wondering about the example you give of you know, the way people, and especially women, are reduced to one particular aspect of their being. So that's the sort of one dimensionality. And one of the examples you gave sort of fairly early on is of this Girls Gone Wild franchise, which is a camera crew goes into colleges and universities and then encourages women to show their breasts or kiss each other, that kind of stuff, where then the women are reduced to just that particular act or that particular physical feature. And you know, the quotation that you have here is sort of in Girls Gone Wild, you are your breasts. Mm. And I was just wondering if, with the changes today with social media, whether there isn't sort of a perpetuation of that to maybe at an even higher level of it, or with greater intensity at least, so that, you know, if you have a selfie, you know, then you are your appearance. Yeah. And then that's also the only thing that counts. So people then take selfies with famous people, and, you know, none of their personality, none of the real relationships show, but you have the selfie, so you were reduced to that selfie. And of course on Twitter, to some extent, it seems to me it's the same, because then people project themselves in a certain way. Very often they want to be perceived as good people, and then they attack other people, sometimes in quite nasty ways, and then they think that makes them even better people. But that is very one-dimensional. So I was just wondering whether, not just with pornography, where, as you say, we've now reached a higher level, or perhaps one should say an even lower point, I don't know, and whether one hasn't the same sort of development, again, not only with pornography, but also with Twitter and Facebook, where again, it's sort of an interaction or a two-way street, because those media require a certain one-dimensionality, but people then also give them that one-dimensionality, and that then becomes the aspiration, to have so many Facebook friends, to be retweeted so many times. So looking at things from that perspective, has that made the one-dimensionality worse, you think?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, something like Instagram is a kind of, a really expansion of the logic of the, of the self-presentation, and because you are doing it, then it sort of has this other dimension in it. I criticize the idea of empowerment, the idea that, anything a woman does is empowering, which was a jokey Onion article. Actually, it's not mentioned in the book, but that, this idea that, everything a woman does is somehow feminist, right? So the idea that taking a selfie is somehow like empowering, when actually you're just sort of like flattening out your life and presenting an image and, for other people to consume. And I think like we've got to such a sort of bizarre extreme where there's this kind of excess of image, a production of but who is actually looking at these things? I mean, who are they actually for? Well, they end up being for the algorithm, you're just feeding machines all of these pictures and words,
And the algorithm is capitalist in nature, because it's all about consumerism and commercialism. It's about these media companies making money on their advertising.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's probably more demonic than, it's something like, the algorithm and AI, their relation to capitalism. Yeah, we could say like, in a way, capitalism tries to use them and constrain them, but who knows, in a way there's a sort of monstrosity to this, everything that's going on, that I think we don't know the consequences of.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is not as restraining it. I mean, it's developed this sort of logic of its own at an incredible speed, so that whatever you do is sort of feeds into that machine and becomes commercialized, and probably to the detriment of context. Something that even when you do a film about the Holocaust or whatever, it must appeal to people. It must be sellable in the literal sense of the word. So it's got to be enjoyable on some level. And if you then work on Twitter and Facebook and you have sort of that secondary level to it, then that makes the machine even more infernal. Mm-hmm. Let's explore in the second part of our interview some of the questions about, if this is the situation as it is, and if it is really that bad, and we can talk about that in a moment as well, is there then a way out? So we'll do that in the second part.
Okay.
Thank you.